Imagine this. You're walking through a sterile hospital corridor at 3 a.m., the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on pale walls. Through a half-open door, you glimpse a figure hunched over in a plastic chair, someone who, just 12 hours ago, was giving a presentation to a boardroom full of executives, commanding respect, wielding influence. Now they're shaking, sweating, begging a nurse for something to make the trembling stop. Their Rolex still gleams on their wrist, but their eyes hold the same desperate hunger you'd see in any alley, any shelter, any place where human beings reach the absolute edge of themselves. Here's what unsettles you most. This person isn't fundamentally different from you. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy their life. They didn't choose weakness over strength, vice over virtue. Something else was at work, something far more complex and terrifying than simple moral failure. They were chasing something that felt like salvation but delivered only deeper chains. Stay with me because what we're about to explore may change the way you perceive human suffering, healing, and the very fabric of consciousness. In this journey, we will delve into the minds of two towering figures in psychology, Carl Gustav Jung, the pioneer of analytical psychology, and Dr. Gabor Maté, a contemporary voice of compassion and clarity in the study of trauma and addiction. Together, their insights reveal something profound. Addiction is not about the substance, it's about the wound. The deeper we understand this truth, the more we can transform lives, perhaps even our own. Before we dive in, if you find value in deep psychological and philosophical explorations like this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video. It not only helps the message spread, it might help someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts. We'll pose questions throughout this video, and your answers could spark a powerful conversation. Trust me, the final insight is the most transformative of all. To begin understanding addiction through the lens of Carl Jung, we must step back into the early 20th century, when Jung began identifying recurring psychological patterns in his patients. For Jung, the human psyche wasn't just a rational machine. It was a complex spiritual organism composed of conscious thoughts, the shadow of the unconscious, and a deeper realm he called the collective unconscious, where archetypes live and breathe. Jung viewed addiction not merely as a compulsive behavior, but as a spiritual crisis. Now imagine peeling back the surface of this moment, like an archaeologist excavating layers of human consciousness. What if I told you that every addiction, whether to heroin, alcohol, work, perfectionism, or the endless scroll of social media, is actually a misdirected search for the same fundamental human need? What if the very thing society condemns as the ultimate weakness is actually a distorted cry for what we all desperately want: wholeness, connection, meaning, and the feeling of being fully alive? This is where the story becomes personal, whether you recognize it or not, because addiction doesn't just live in hospital rooms and rehabilitation centers. It lives in the executive who can't stop checking emails at dinner, knowing it's destroying their marriage. It lives in the parent who medicates childhood trauma with perfectionist control over their children's lives. It lives in the spiritual seeker who uses meditation as another form of escape from the very emotions they need to feel in order to heal. You see, we've been asking the wrong question entirely. We ask, why can't they just stop? When we should be asking, what pain are they trying to escape? We ask, what's wrong with them? When we should be asking, what happened to them? This single shift in perspective, from judgment to curiosity, from condemnation to compassion, changes everything. It transforms the addict from a moral failure into a human being attempting to solve an impossible equation: how to survive unbearable inner pain in a world that offers no real refuge. But here's the paradox that will haunt you. The very behavior that seems to destroy lives is often the same mechanism that once saved them. The child who learned to disappear emotionally to survive a chaotic household becomes the adult who numbs feelings with substances. The teenager who discovered that academic achievement earned love and approval becomes the workaholic who can't rest without earning their worth. The sensitive soul who found that helping others felt safer than being vulnerable themselves becomes addicted to caretaking, sacrificing their own needs until they're completely empty. What if addiction isn't the problem, but the solution? Not a good solution, not a healthy solution, but the best solution that person could find with the resources they had at the time? What if every addictive behavior is actually an attempt to return to some lost part of themselves? Some original wholeness that was fractured by trauma, neglect, or the simple brutality of growing up human in a world that often demands we abandon our authentic selves to belong? Two revolutionary thinkers understood this truth decades before neuroscience could prove it. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the hidden territories of the human psyche, saw addiction as a spiritual crisis, a misdirected search for transcendence. Gabor Maté, the Hungarian-Canadian physician who spent decades treating addiction in Vancouver's most desperate neighborhoods, recognized it as trauma expressing itself through the body's desperate attempt to regulate pain. Together, their insights reveal something that will fundamentally alter how you see human suffering. Addiction is not about weakness, genetics, or moral failure. It's about disconnection from self, from others, from meaning, from the very essence of what makes us feel alive and whole. And if disconnection is the problem, then reconnection becomes the path home. But this raises the most unsettling question of all. If addiction is really about this fundamental human need for connection and wholeness, then what does that say about you? What are the behaviors, patterns, and compulsions in your own life that might be serving the same function, protecting you from pain while simultaneously preventing you from truly living? The answer to that question lies deeper than you might be willing to go. But why does this disconnection happen in the first place? Why do human beings, born into this world with an innate capacity for joy, wonder, and authentic connection, end up fragmenting themselves into pieces, desperately seeking wholeness through substances, behaviors, and endless distractions that only deepen their isolation? The answer lies buried in the very foundations of human development, in the cruel mathematics of survival that every child must learn. Jung understood this with startling clarity when he wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. What he meant was this: when we cannot bear to feel what we actually need to feel in order to heal, our psyche creates symptoms, including addiction, as a protective mechanism. Consider the architecture of a child's mind. You enter this world as a whole being, integrated and authentic, with your emotional truth visible on your face and your needs expressed without shame. But the world you encounter is not designed for wholeness. It's designed for conformity, productivity, and emotional regulation that serves others' comfort rather than your own truth. The message becomes clear quickly. Certain parts of you are welcome, others are not. Your anger is too much. Your sadness is inconvenient. Your fear is weakness. Your authentic self is somehow wrong. This is where the great fracturing begins, not through dramatic trauma alone, but through the 1,000 small betrayals of a world that demands you abandon pieces of yourself to belong. Jung called this process the creation of the shadow. All the disowned, repressed, and exiled parts of the self that don't fit society's narrow definitions of acceptability. But here's what Jung knew that modern psychology often misses. What we suppress doesn't disappear. It festers in the darkness, growing more desperate with each passing year, until it finally erupts through addiction, depression, rage, or the endless pursuit of external validation. Gabor Maté takes this understanding even deeper into the realm of neurobiology and attachment theory. He reveals that trauma isn't just what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. A child's developing brain is exquisitely sensitive to their emotional environment. When that environment is characterized by neglect, abuse, or even well-meaning but emotionally unavailable parents, the child's nervous system adapts by learning to suppress their authentic responses and needs. The child who cries for attention and receives rejection learns that their emotional truth is dangerous. The child who expresses anger and faces abandonment learns that their authentic power must be hidden. The child who shows vulnerability and encounters mockery learns that their tender heart is a liability. These aren't conscious decisions, they're survival adaptations written into the very structure of the developing brain. But here's where the story becomes truly heartbreaking. These same adaptations that save the child become the prison of the adult. The emotional suppression that protected them from childhood abandonment becomes the emotional numbness that drives them towards substances in adulthood. The hypervigilance that helped them navigate an unpredictable household becomes the anxiety that makes rest impossible without chemical assistance. The people-pleasing that earned them scraps of conditional love becomes the addiction to approval that leaves them completely disconnected from their own desires and needs. Friedrich Nietzsche, long before modern neuroscience confirmed his intuitions, wrote that what does not kill me makes me stronger. But this popular misinterpretation of his philosophy misses the darker truth he was actually pointing toward. What doesn't kill you often damages you in ways that take decades to fully understand. The strength we develop through suffering is real, but it often comes at the cost of losing touch with our authentic selves. Viktor Frankl, writing from his experience in Nazi concentration camps, observed that humans can endure almost any suffering if they can find meaning in it. But what happens when that meaning becomes distorted? What happens when the child learns to find meaning not in being themselves, but in being what others need them to be? This is where addiction often begins, not as a search for pleasure, but as a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between the false self they've learned to present to the world and the authentic self they've buried beneath layers of protective strategies. Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who we truly are, reveals why addiction is so persistent and why traditional treatment approaches often fail. You cannot simply remove an addictive behavior without addressing the underlying fragmentation that created the need for that behavior in the first place. The addiction is doing something crucial. It's temporarily reuniting the person with disowned parts of themselves, giving them fleeting access to emotions, experiences, and states of being that their sober, socially acceptable life has made impossible to access. The workaholic who can only access vulnerability when drunk isn't just seeking intoxication, they're seeking themselves. The perfectionist who binges on food in secret isn't just seeking comfort, they're seeking permission to have needs. The helper who becomes addicted to crisis and drama isn't just seeking excitement, they're seeking a socially acceptable way to express their own unmet need for care and attention. This is why shame-based treatment approaches not only fail, but actually strengthen the addictive cycle. When you tell someone that their addiction is evidence of their weakness, their moral failure, or their lack of willpower, you're actually reinforcing the very disconnection from self that created the addiction in the first place. You're adding another layer of exile, another part of themselves they must disown to be acceptable. But there's something even more insidious at work in modern society, something that both Jung and Maté recognized as the breeding ground for widespread addiction and psychological suffering. We live in a culture that has systematically dismantled the very structures that once provided meaning, community, and authentic connection. We've replaced extended family systems with nuclear isolation, replaced ritual and ceremony with consumption, replaced genuine community with social media performance. The result is a society of walking wounded people who look successful on the outside but are dying of spiritual starvation on the inside. Jung warned that when the spiritual dimension of life is ignored, the psyche will invent substitutes, obsessions, addictions, and extremism of all kinds. We see this everywhere now, not just in traditional addiction, but in the compulsive pursuit of wealth, status, perfectionism, and digital validation. The question that emerges from this understanding is both terrifying and liberating. If addiction is really the result of this fundamental disconnection from self and meaning, then what would happen if we stopped trying to fix the addiction and started trying to heal the disconnection? What would happen if we stopped asking, how do we make them stop, and started asking, how do we help them come home to themselves? The answer to that question requires us to look even deeper into the specific ways this disconnection manifests in the body, the mind, and the soul, and how these manifestations create the perfect storm for addictive behavior to flourish. Here's what nobody tells you about the walking wounded. They don't look wounded. They're sitting next to you in boardrooms, teaching your children, performing surgery, writing laws, and running countries. They've become masters of what psychologists call functional dysfunction, the ability to achieve external success while remaining completely disconnected from their internal reality. And this disconnection doesn't just create individual suffering, it creates the very systems and structures that perpetuate collective trauma on a massive scale. The consequences of this epidemic disconnection are far more devastating than we realize, precisely because they're largely invisible. When someone collapses from a heart attack, we rush to help. When someone slowly dies from emotional starvation while maintaining a perfect social media presence, we don't even notice. Yet the latter is happening millions of times over, creating a society of people who are technically alive but not truly living. Consider the neuroscience of disconnection. When a child's authentic emotional expressions are consistently met with rejection, abandonment, or punishment, their developing brain learns to shut down the neural pathways associated with those emotions. This isn't a conscious choice, it's a survival adaptation. The brain literally rewires itself to prioritize external acceptance over internal truth. The child learns to monitor other people's faces and moods more carefully than their own hunger, fatigue, or emotional needs. But here's the devastating long-term consequence. By adulthood, these neural pathways have become so entrenched that the person has lost access to their own internal guidance system. They can tell you what everyone else needs, wants, and feels, but they have no idea what they themselves actually need, want, or feel. They've become strangers to themselves, operating from a false self that was constructed to survive childhood but is completely inadequate for creating a meaningful adult life. This is where addiction becomes almost inevitable. When you're disconnected from your own internal compass, how do you know when you're hungry versus when you're tired versus when you're lonely versus when you're overwhelmed? All of these different needs start to feel the same, like a vague sense of something's wrong that demands immediate relief. The substance, the behavior, the compulsive activity becomes a crude substitute for the sophisticated internal awareness that was never allowed to develop. Jung understood this phenomenon through his concept of the persona, the mask we wear to interface with the world. He recognized that while everyone needs some degree of persona to function socially, problems arise when the persona becomes so thick and rigid that the person loses access to their authentic self underneath. The addiction then becomes a desperate attempt to break through the persona, to access some semblance of authentic feeling and experience, even if it's destructive. But the consequences extend far beyond the individual. When large numbers of people are operating from false selves, disconnected from their authentic needs and emotions, they create systems and institutions that reflect this same disconnection. We end up with economic systems that prioritize profit over human well-being, political systems that reward performance over authenticity, educational systems that value compliance over creativity, and healthcare systems that treat symptoms while ignoring root causes. The person who learned in childhood that their worth depended on their productivity becomes the boss who creates workplaces where employees are valued only for their output. The person who learned that their emotions were dangerous becomes the parent who unconsciously teaches their children to suppress their feelings. The person who learned that vulnerability equals weakness becomes the leader who makes decisions from fear rather than wisdom. The individual trauma becomes collective trauma, passed down through generations and embedded in our cultural DNA. Gabor Maté has observed that addiction rates are highest in societies with the greatest inequality and social fragmentation. This isn't coincidence, it's cause and effect. When a society systematically destroys the conditions necessary for human connection and meaning, it creates the perfect breeding ground for addictive behavior. We've created a culture that simultaneously demands emotional regulation while providing no healthy means for achieving it, that promises fulfillment through external achievement while systematically destroying the internal resources necessary for genuine satisfaction. Consider the modern epidemic of what researchers call diseases of civilization: depression, anxiety, autoimmune disorders, chronic pain, and addiction. These aren't separate problems requiring separate solutions. They're different expressions of the same underlying disconnection from self, others, and meaning. The body that was taught not to feel eventually rebels through physical symptoms. The mind that was forced to suppress its truth eventually breaks down through mental illness. The spirit that was denied expression eventually seeks it through destructive behaviors. The most insidious aspect of this disconnection is how it becomes normalized. We live in a culture that celebrates busyness as virtue, that equates rest with laziness, that sees emotional expression as unprofessional, that treats vulnerability as weakness. We've made the symptoms of disconnection into cultural values, then wonder why so many people are struggling with addiction, depression, and chronic illness. The cognitive bias that keeps this system in place is what psychologists call normalization of deviance, the tendency to accept lower and lower standards as normal when the decline happens gradually. We've gradually accepted that it's normal for children to be medicated for paying attention to their emotions instead of their schoolwork. We've accepted that it's normal for adults to need pharmaceutical intervention to sleep, to feel motivated, to experience pleasure. We've accepted that it's normal to be so disconnected from our bodies that we need external experts to tell us what we're feeling and what we need. But perhaps the most devastating consequence is intergenerational. Children don't do what we tell them to do, they do what we do. When parents are operating from false selves, medicating their own disconnection through work, addiction, perfectionism, or substance use, their children absorb this modeling at a cellular level. The child learns not through lectures about healthy living, but through witnessing whether their parents are actually capable of accessing joy, rest, authenticity, and genuine connection. This is why traditional addiction treatment focuses solely on behavior modification and external control has such limited success rates. It's trying to solve a spiritual and developmental problem with behavioral and medical interventions. It's like trying to heal a broken bone with positive thinking. The intervention doesn't match the level at which the problem actually exists. The hidden tragedy is that most people suffering from addiction are actually more sensitive, not less sensitive, than the general population. They feel more deeply, care more intensely, and are more aware of the pain and disconnection around them. Their addiction is often an attempt to turn down the volume on a nervous system that's overwhelmed by a world that has become increasingly hostile to human sensitivity and authenticity. What emerges from this understanding is both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because it reveals that addiction is not an individual moral failure, but a predictable response to systemic disconnection. Hopeful because it suggests that healing is possible not through more control, more shame, or more external intervention, but through reconnection to the authentic self that was never actually lost, only buried under layers of protective adaptation. But reconnection requires something that our culture actively discourages: the willingness to feel what we've spent years learning not to feel, to slow down enough to notice what we've been running from, and to risk the vulnerability of showing up authentically in a world that often punishes such honesty. The question becomes, are we brave enough to examine not just individual addiction, but the collective addiction to disconnection that creates the conditions where individual addiction flourishes? The rebellion begins with a single revolutionary act. You stop running. Not from the substance, not from the behavior, not from the external addiction, but from yourself. You stop running from the emotions you've been taught are unacceptable, from the needs you've learned are selfish, from the truth you've been convinced is too much for others to handle. This is where real recovery begins, not in abstinence, but in presence. Jung understood that what we resist persists, and what we accept transforms. The very emotions, memories, and experiences that drive addictive behavior are also the doorways to healing, but only if we're willing to turn toward them with curiosity instead of judgment, with compassion instead of condemnation. This requires a complete reversal of everything our culture teaches about dealing with difficult emotions. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" the recovering person learns to ask, "What is this feeling trying to tell me?" Instead of, "How do I control this craving?" they ask, "What need is this craving pointing toward?" Instead of, "How do I become strong enough to resist?" they ask, "How do I become whole enough to choose?" This shift from resistance to curiosity, from control to understanding, changes everything. But here's what makes this rebellion truly radical. It requires you to develop a completely different relationship with discomfort. Our entire culture is built on the premise that discomfort is a problem to be solved, a signal that something is wrong that needs to be fixed immediately. The recovery rebellion recognizes that discomfort is often information, guidance, and sometimes the very energy needed for transformation. Consider the person who discovers that their work addiction isn't really about loving their job. It's about avoiding the terror of being still long enough to feel how empty they are inside. The traditional approach says, find better work, life balance, learn time management, set boundaries. The rebellion approach says, what would it be like to sit with that emptiness without immediately trying to fill it? What if that emptiness isn't actually a problem, but a space that's been cleared for something new to emerge? This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes revolutionary. He saw psychological symptoms not as diseases to be cured, but as calls from the unconscious, invitations to reclaim disowned parts of the self. The depression isn't just brain chemistry gone wrong, it's the soul's rebellion against a life that has become too small, too false, too disconnected from authentic purpose. The anxiety isn't just overactive neurons, it's the body's wisdom saying, something about how you're living is not sustainable. Gabor Maté takes this understanding into the realm of practical healing through what he calls compassionate inquiry. This approach doesn't try to eliminate symptoms, but to understand their deeper message. When someone says, "I can't stop drinking," the compassionate inquiry response isn't, "You need more willpower," but "What happens inside you when you don't drink?" What does the alcohol help you not feel? This line of questioning often reveals that the addiction is actually the person's best attempt at self-medication for conditions that were never properly addressed: childhood trauma, developmental trauma, or what Maté calls the trauma of not being seen for who you truly are. The alcohol isn't the problem, it's the solution to a much deeper problem. And you can't heal a solution. You can only heal the original wound that made that solution necessary. But here's where the rebellion becomes truly dangerous to the status quo. It requires us to question not just individual behavior, but the systems that create the need for that behavior. If someone is addicted to work because they learned in childhood that their worth depends on their productivity, healing requires not just individual therapy, but examining the economic and social systems that exploit this wound for profit. If someone is addicted to perfectionism because they grew up in a family where mistakes were met with emotional abandonment, healing requires not just personal work, but questioning cultural messages that equate human value with flawless performance. The rebellion against addiction becomes a rebellion against all the forces, family, cultural, economic, spiritual, that demand we abandon our authentic selves to belong. This is why genuine recovery often looks like social rebellion. The person who heals from people-pleasing addiction starts setting boundaries that make others uncomfortable. The person who recovers from work addiction starts prioritizing rest and relationships over achievement, which challenges everyone around them who is still caught in the productivity trap. The person who heals from perfectionism starts showing up authentically, which gives others permission to drop their own masks or threatens them enough that they try to pull the person back into the old dynamic. Jung wrote about this phenomenon in his work on the collective shadow. When one person in a family or social system starts doing their inner work and reclaiming their authentic self, it creates pressure on everyone else in the system to do the same work or to resist the change. This is why recovery is often met with sabotage from the very people who claim they want the person to get well. Their unconscious investment in the person staying sick, because it allows them to avoid looking at their own wounds, creates relationship crises that many people in recovery aren't prepared for. But here's the key insight that changes everything. You cannot recover alone, but you also cannot wait for others to recover with you. The path requires finding what Maté calls authentic relationships, connections with people who can see and accept your full humanity, not just the parts that make them comfortable. This often means ending relationships that were based on your false self and cultivating new ones that can handle your authenticity. The rebellion also requires developing what Jung called symbolic thinking, the ability to understand that your symptoms and behaviors are not just literal problems, but symbolic communications from your unconscious. The person who binges on food when stressed isn't just lacking willpower, they're trying to nurture themselves the only way they know how, probably because they never learned healthy self-soothing from caregivers who were themselves unable to self-regulate. There comes a moment in every journey of authentic healing when the person recovering from addiction, or anyone recovering from the addiction to living a false life, stands at the edge of a profound recognition that changes everything. It's the moment when they realize that what they've been seeking through substances, behaviors, achievements, or relationships was never actually outside themselves. They weren't chasing the substance. They weren't chasing the behavior. They were chasing themselves, not the self they became through adaptation and survival, but the self they were before the world told them who they had to be to belong. This is the ultimate paradox of addiction. The very thing that seems to destroy lives is actually a misdirected attempt to save them. Every addiction, at its deepest core, is a search for home, a return to the original wholeness that was fractured by trauma, neglect, or simply the impossible demands of growing up human in a world that often requires us to abandon our authentic nature to survive. Jung understood this when he told Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, that the craving of the alcoholic was actually a low-level spiritual thirst for wholeness. The addict isn't trying to escape life, they're trying to find life, to access states of being that their ordinary, socially acceptable existence has made impossible to reach. The problem isn't the desire for transcendence. The problem is that the methods being used to achieve it are ultimately self-destructive. But here's what changes everything. When you understand that addiction is a spiritual crisis masquerading as a behavioral problem, you realize that recovery is not about learning to live without something. Recovery is about learning to live with everything, all of your emotions, all of your history, all of your humanity without needing to medicate, escape, or numb any of it. This shift in understanding transforms the entire landscape of healing. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this addiction?" the question becomes, "How do I reclaim the parts of myself that I lost along the way?" Instead of, "How do I control my cravings?" the question becomes, "What is my soul craving that I've been trying to satisfy with substances or behaviors?" Gabor Maté has witnessed this transformation thousands of times in his work with the most severely addicted populations. He describes moments when people who have been written off by every system, medical, legal, social, suddenly remember who they were before the trauma, before the shame, before the desperate attempt to survive unbearable inner pain. In these moments of recognition, something that was frozen begins to thaw, something that was fragmented begins to integrate, something that was exiled begins to come home. But this homecoming is not gentle or comfortable. It requires feeling everything that was too painful to feel the first time around. It requires grieving not just what happened to you, but who you had to become because of what happened to you. It requires mourning the authentic self that was abandoned in childhood, the dreams that were sacrificed for survival, the parts of your humanity that were deemed unacceptable by the people whose love you needed most. Jung called this process the dark night of the soul, a period of psychological death and rebirth that cannot be avoided, only traversed. The person must go through the full experience of their disconnection to reach the other side where reconnection becomes possible. This is why quick fixes, behavioral interventions, and willpower-based approaches ultimately fail. They try to bypass the very process that contains the seeds of transformation. The most profound realization in this journey is that your addiction was never your problem. It was your solution. It was your psyche's best attempt to solve an impossible equation. How to survive emotional pain that felt overwhelming while still functioning in a world that demanded you keep performing, producing, and pretending everything was fine. The addiction was actually a form of self-care, albeit a destructive one. It was saying, "This human being is in too much pain to function without help." This understanding removes shame from the equation entirely. You weren't weak for becoming addicted. You were resourceful. You weren't morally flawed. You were wounded. You weren't choosing vice over virtue. You were choosing survival over death, even when that survival strategy eventually began killing you slowly. The shame that drives addiction begins to dissolve when you realize that your addiction was actually evidence of your will to live, not your desire to die. But here's where the transformation becomes truly revolutionary. When you stop judging your addiction and start honoring it as your psyche's attempt to survive and heal, you can begin to ask a different question. What would it look like to meet these same needs in ways that actually nourish rather than deplete me? The person addicted to alcohol who realizes they were actually seeking permission to feel their emotions can begin exploring healthy ways to access and express those feelings. The person addicted to work who recognizes they were trying to prove their worth can begin the process of learning that their value isn't contingent on their productivity. The person addicted to relationships who understands they were trying to heal childhood abandonment wounds can start developing a secure relationship with themselves first. This is why the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. Connection to your body, connection to your emotions, connection to your truth, connection to others, connection to meaning, connection to the sacred dimension of existence that Jung recognized as essential to psychological health. When you are truly connected to yourself, you don't need to escape yourself. When you are truly connected to life, you don't need to numb life. When you are truly connected to love, you don't need to chase love through substances, behaviors, or people who can't actually see you. You are already home. You always were. The journey was never about getting somewhere else. It was about removing everything that was blocking you from recognizing where you've been all along. Welcome back.